You may not have heard the name Mandaean before, and you may wonder what that is. And you shouldn't blame yourself, because it is a word that you hear very rarely. And it doesn't mean it's unimportant, but many important things are not known. So to connect it with, maybe you can think about Aramaic, and some of you may have heard Aramaic. And the thing with Aramaic too is very few people know about it, but well, Aramaic was one of those languages that was really pretty much everywhere from the first millennium to today. It's still a living language. So amongst those languages in humankind that have the longest living trajectory. But because it constantly changed, it fluctuated between showing up as this dialect and this dialect and this dialect, one doesn't see it in its totality, and it was not as linguists define what is a dialect and what is a language. Well, a language is a dialect with an army. Aramaic usually did not have that, and therefore its continuity as a language is not known, and Mandaic is one of its dialects. Aramaic once had an army, but that was when the Achaemenids made it its official language, called Imperial Aramaic. But interestingly, it was not their language. They took a foreign language to become a language, a communicative language for their area in Iran. And interestingly, they picked that language. Well, why did they do so? Because most people understood it. Back to Mandaean, which is also not only interesting as a dialect of Arabic, and here I'll become personal. It has a very, very interesting writing system. And as you may know, Semitic writing systems are incredibly creative. Even within Aramaic, the number of alphabets in which it is written is very numerous, but then you go back to another Semitic languages, you have syllabic writing. And when I say alphabet, it's not exactly like our alphabet functions, because there's no such thing as a short vowel. So when you read Arabic, and you read actually what's there, a couple of things are missing, you have to know where to put them. However, Mandaeans were very smart. The Greeks did that in a way, but the Mandaeans did that too, and independently from each other. So you have this alphabet, think like an IBM card, where some of the old signs are no longer used because certain sounds were lost in the alphabet. So you had these useless letters. So what you do? Well, there are some things you'd like to write. So you take the useless letters and you fill them with those letters you want to write. And this word, so it has A, E, I, U, which probably no other Semitic language writing system has. So the Mandaeans were incredibly inventive about retooling their writing system. That's the anecdote. I should finally say something about our presenter, Charles Häberl. And the specifics is a PhD thesis at Harvard University 2006, which he did under the guidance of John Hünegard, probably one of the prominent Semitists in the world. And it was on a Neo-Mandaic dialect published of Khurram Shahar, published 3 years. That is a record time of publishing a dissertation, 2009 with Brill Academic Publishers. And he's also written, now this classical, he's written in the most recent survey of the Semitic languages, the handbook, the article on Neo-Mandaic. Again, Aramaic spans this incredible time from the first millennium to today. Think about German in that way, it's not possible, or English. Charles has an incredible breadth. Not only is he a Semitist in a classical way, a philologist who, meaning not only literally loves language, but who knows the intricacies of the language in terms of its documented information. But he brings to this a number of other disciplines. He brings folklore, he brings epigraphy, he brings performance theory. So you need the specifics of the philology, but he brings to it the other approaches to make those sources speak. And this is where scholarship sort of connects the past and the present. And one way he connects the present is that he thinks about what happens when languages die. And we live in a world today when all of us use English. Most of the people using English are not using it as a first language, but as a second and very often a third. And therefore, that's great. But the specifics get lost. And that reminds me of an anecdote. I will close with the anecdote. It's a movie by Werner Herzog, Where Green Ants Dream, wo die grünen Ameisen träumen. And it's about Aborigines in Australia. And there's one scene that is about a land dispute, which has a certain object, and the owner of it can prove the property by showing this object. And as Werner Herzog shows this scene in the movie, the object is never shown. And it's sort of a respect of the of Werner Herzog to that. You sort of don't need to see that. But a man shows up and gives a very, very long speech, which is fully shown in the movie. And then later people look at each other and, oh, what did he say? And then another Aborigine crops up and said, well, this man is the last to speak this language. So nobody understands him, and the language will die with him. And that reminds me of a similar situation with my professor once, Rainer Vogt, who's a specialist in Ethiopic languages, and who once mentioned when we talked about that subject, there's a particular Ethiopic language where there's still 4 known speakers. And they may not be alive by now, but you know better than me. So in this respect, we hear more from Charles about from Jerusalem to the Karun. What can Mandaean geographies tell us?
Good evening. I'd like to thank you for joining us tonight at the American Academy, as well as my fellow Berlin Prize recipients, and the staff of the American Academy who have done so much to make our stays here productive and comfortable. I'd also like to thank Anna Maria Kellen for sponsoring my fellowship, and of course Beatrice for the very wonderful and warm introduction that you gave me. The inspiration for my title is a pair of verses from an ancient religious text called the Book of John, which describe all of humanity falling into a state of stupefaction at the birth of John the Baptist. The universality of this portentous event is metonomically conveyed by a poetic device known as a merism, in which the city of Jerusalem stands for the west and the Iran's Karun River stands for the east. And the juxtaposition of the two represent the entire known world. These are, in fact, the two poles between which stand the subject of my lecture, the Mandaean community formerly of Iraq and Iran. At this point, you may well be asking yourself, who are these Mandæans, and why do we need a geography lesson about them? That's a very good question. I'm very glad that you've asked me. The Mandæans are the adherents of a sect conventionally described as Gnostic. In fact, their name, Mandoye, literally means the people of knowledge, or gnosis, and they're the only such surviving sect from the period of late antiquity in the Middle East or anywhere else. Although it should be said that Gnosticism has enjoyed a bit of a renaissance of late in the New Ager community, and some of the more peculiar aspects of evangelical Christianity, as it is understood and practiced in America, such as prosperity theology and premillennialism, share certain uncomfortable similarities with Gnosticism, certain much maligned Gnostic doctrines as practiced in the past. The core of their beliefs is an esoteric doctrine called Nasirutha, or Nazaritism. What this means is, according to their beliefs, they preserve the secret doctrines of Samson, Samuel, and John the Baptist, all of whom are described as Nazarites in the Bible. They claim that the Nazarene followers of John the Baptist fled from Jerusalem after the destruction of that city to a place of refuge called Inner Harran. This and all of their other accounts are related in a corpus of sacred texts composed in a dialect of Aramaic very similar to that of the Babylonian Talmud. In keeping with the followers of the Baptist, their principal ritual is, of course, full immersion baptism in running water. In practically every respect, the Mandæans fit our preconceived notions of Oriental mystics. Pacifist, bearded, and pescatarian, their heads swaddled in white turbans, they follow a faith that is ancient, obscure, and esoteric. They are also, incidentally, among the most photogenic groups from the region, as this image from a Mandaean baptism ceremony demonstrates. In keeping with this role of bearded mystic sages from the Orient, they can indeed teach us quite a great deal about ourselves, and specifically about the emergence of the phenomenon of Orientalism from religious concerns, rather than merely political or economic ones. They can also teach us about what is known today as political or radical Islam, and even how all these phenomena relate to global popular culture today. I will additionally attempt to show that Mandæans, now displaced from their homelands, are a real people, and they follow a real religion, and they really did once belong to a real place. And that what we may term scholarship, whether it be Orientalist, Islamist, or popular, has played a very important role in this history of displacement, due to its ambivalence or inability to account for their reality. So, let us begin. Mandæans have been the subject of Western scholarship since the 17th century, at least, when their presence in the region around Basra was first documented by European travelers and missionaries who were engaged in their own projects to document the region in all of its religious diversity and employ this knowledge in pursuit of various agendas. Although my colleague Edmondo Lupieri has documented how these missionary efforts ultimately led to disappointment and frustration, at least for the missionaries and their sponsors, it was only really in the 20th century that their religious legitimacy and authenticity became seriously challenged, when they were thrust into the center of the scholarly debate over Christian origins. The main reason for this was a general ignorance about their faith, in large part due to the fact that almost none of their texts had ever been translated, and vanishingly few outside their community were conversant in their language. All of their chief texts, as I mentioned before, are composed in a dialect of Aramaic, in a script unique to their community. And it was impossible to engage with Mandaean religious claims without first mastering this language and the script in which it's written. The sole exception was the Swedish scholar Matthias Norberg, idiosyncratic Latin translation of the principal Mandaean work, The Great Treasure, which he published under the title Codex Nazareus. Despite the limitations of this edition, which were myriad, it emerged at precisely and serendipitously a time in which scholarly and lay audiences in the West were becoming increasingly interested in esoteric and occult ideas. As typified first and foremost by the career of Lady Helena Petrovna Blavatsky, a Russian occultist, medium, and spiritualist, that's her right there, who launched the American New Age movement by founding the Theosophical Society, a kind of prototypical Church of Scientology. You can see her pictured here on the left, and the gentleman with the magnificent beard, that's Colonel Henry Steele Olcott. He was the first American convert to Buddhism, the first in a series of very many American converts to Buddhism. Her earliest works on what would eventually come to be known as Theosophism, these were Isis Unveiled and The Secret Doctrine, demonstrate a clear dependence on Norberg's Codex Nazareus, from which she quotes extensively and approvingly. Mandæans are, in fact, probably best known as a result of their indirect contributions to this counterculture. They were one of the inspirations for the Gnostic Johannite Prière des Sions in Dan Brown's The Da Vinci Code, and they have a tendency to pop up in the works of his imitators as well. So, despite its influence upon the nascent New Age movement, Mandaean literature was not truly accessible to a broader public until the 1910s and 1920s, when the Göttingen scholar Mark Lidzbarski published his landmark translations of the chief Mandaean scriptures, which were enthusiastically embraced by an immediate and engaged audience. Within this audience, at least as enthusiastically as anything we could write would be embraced. Within this audience were exponents, here we go, of the, sorry, I'm having technical difficulties here. Within this audience were exponents of what might be termed the Religionsgeschichtliche Schule. And I've included some of their names here as well. And they were at that time engaged in actually countering long-held Christian discourses about origins and the relationship of Christianity to other faith traditions. As a consequence, when Lidzbarski issued his texts and when Reitzenstein and his colleagues issued these their new views upon Christian origins and tried to tend to extend these texts and make them relevant to the study of Christian origins, there was an immediate and harsh reaction. Scholars such as Sven Pallas, Burkett, and Litzmann argued, quite effectively, that the Mandæans were late, probably even post-Islamic, and therefore they're completely irrelevant to the study of Christian origins, and they should be disregarded. And at that point, by this point in the 1930s, it seemed as if the Mandaean question had been answered. Or had it? In 1931, the Iraqi historian Abdurrazak al-Hassani published the first edition of his work on the Mandæans, which was initially entitled Sabi'atu Qadiman wa Hadithan, and subsequently in two later editions, it was known as Asabi'un fi Hadirihim wa Madihim, in which he directly addresses the claims of French Orientalists such as Nicolas Siufi and Henri Pognon, and indirectly those of the German and British Orientalists, such as Lidzbarski and Schwolson. I believe this is because he didn't actually read German or English, so he had to engage them through the French sources. And we can see one of the conclusions of his books right here, وَإِذَا اعْتَبَرْنَا دِيَانَةُ صَبِيَّةِ هِيَ عِبَادَةُ الْكَوَاكِبِ وَالنُّجُومِ فَلَا شَكَّ إِنَّهَا أَقْدَمَ دِيَانَةً عَرَفَهَا الْبَشَرُ فِي عَصْرِ التَّارِيخِ. Right? It must be the oldest religion in the world. As a consequence of this, a number of religious authorities have lately issued legal briefs or fatwas concerning the Mandæans. Chief among them, the Grand Ayatollah Muhammad Sa'id al-Hakim, who is one of the only 4 Grand Ayatollahs in Iraq, and the most influential cleric there after Ali Sistani. These briefs, which are informed by the debates of the 20th century, have basically broken with the traditional consensus regarding the religious legitimacy of the Mandaean faith and require that they either convert to Islam or they accept segregation and persecution. Sorry. Lest we simply restrict our comments of criticism here to our colleagues in the Middle East, Islamist and Orientalist scholars, I need also to add at this point that while there are many things that Christian evangelists and Islamic fundamentalists may not agree upon, actually the status of the Mandæans provides them with an opportunity for interfaith dialogue. So I've included a few choice quotes here. One evangelical thinker opined that the impending extinction of the Mandaean faith at the hands of Islamists was actually a great leap forward for evangelicals like him. One of the few scholarly contributions to the question of the Mandaean refugee problem is actually a PhD dissertation that was completed at Liberty University in the state of Virginia in the United States, in which the author of this, Karen Baker, concludes that the persecution of the Mandæans at this point actually provides Christians with an unprecedented opportunity to force them to abandon their own faith and embrace a new one. Now, many of you are probably asking yourself, where is this Liberty University? And even if you do know where Liberty University is, you're probably saying, well, and quite rightly, it's not the equivalent of a Harvard or a Freie Universität. To this quite legitimate criticism, I'd like to say that Liberty University is the largest evangelical Christian university in the world. And it is the only university, it is the university in which the most presidential debates have met to give addresses. And this includes, of course, Donald Trump, it includes Bernie Sanders, it includes Ben Carson, Dr. Ben Carson. It also includes Ted Cruz, who launched his presidential campaign from there. And just last night, Mike Pence was at Liberty University doing some fence mending with the evangelical community, because that's how important liberty is to the evangelical community. So, in short, Liberty University matters very much for the question of this debate. So, what happens to a community when seemingly the entire world has decided that it just doesn't fit in? Where then do the Mandæans belong, if not in Iraq? It seems to me that there's a growing consensus in places like the US and its coalition allies, which must undoubtedly bear some responsibility for the current state of affairs in which the Mandæans discover themselves, that they don't belong here. We've heard from the Orientalists, we've heard from the Islamists, we have even heard from Dan Brown. But what do their accounts about the region tell us about their place within the world? This is a question, I'm sure you'll agree, that has real-world consequences. Now, you may have gotten the impression that I'm here simply to bash these three groups, and particularly the Orientalists, because they're the ones who apparently got us started on this whole debate, but nothing could be further from the truth. As an Orientalist myself, and as an activist, the least I can do is turn the Orientalist gaze in upon itself to relocate this displaced group, and I shall do so by employing some of the most traditional tools in the Orientalist toolkit. To this end, I have embarked upon a research project on Mandaean legends of persecution and migration, in an attempt to identify the places and the spaces they formerly occupied through history, and explore how they reacted to the challenges and the successes they encountered there, as this quote from an exhibition at the Institute for the Study of the Ancient World in New York encourages us to do. In their research into the history of the Mandaean community and its comings and goings throughout history, scholars can draw upon at least 4 sources, here presented in no particular order. Their present, by which I mean pre-2003 distribution, their own oral traditions, the archaeological evidence associated with their community, and their own written texts. One of the central arguments in favor of what I call the pagan origins hypothesis is that Mandæans are currently associated with the marshy regions at the head of the Gulf. And indeed, prior to 2003, that is where the bulk of the community resided, save for a diaspora to regional and national centers such as Baghdad and Tehran, in keeping with the increasing urbanization of the region. The distribution of Mandæans after 2003 is slightly different. Recent events prove, more than anything else, that the Mandæans are capable of relocating themselves, particularly when their lives are on the line. And that just because they were primarily in southern Iraq until 2003 doesn't mean that they necessarily have been there since the dawn of time. Now, the Mandæans themselves have always maintained that they had immigrated there from somewhere else. The premier Mandaeologist of the 20th century, Stefana Drauer, collected oral traditions situating their original homeland somewhere to the north of the then current distribution of the Mandæans, in and around a legendary mountain of the Mandæans, also known as Jebel Madai, because, in her words, the Arabs called the Jebel Mandai the Jebel Madai. Although these traditions have not received as much attention as the written sources concerning the origins of the Mandæans, and in fact, most other scholars have been absolutely dismissive of the Mandæans' claims about their own origins, it bears noting that oral traditions can sometimes manifest a surprising antiquity. The first century Greek geographer and historian Strabo relates such a tradition in his geography that Piraeus, the port of Athens, had previously been an island. A group of French and Greek geologists and archaeologists conducted soundings to extract sediment cores and demonstrated that, indeed, the peninsula that Piraeus currently is on had actually been an island 6,000 years ago. This means that the oral traditions concerning Piraeus and its position as an island had survived for at least 2,000, maybe even 4,000 years before Strabo recorded them for us. Considerably less time separates Drower from the traditions of her informants. These traditions of migration are also corroborated by written sources from the period of late antiquity, such as that of Theodore Bar Konai, who also claims that they moved to Babylonia from an undisclosed location in northern Mesopotamia. The sole archaeological witnesses to the presence of the Mandæans in the region are a number of incantation texts composed in the uniquely Mandaic script and either inscribed upon terracotta bowls or incised into sheets of lead. The former were probably inscribed sometime between the 5th and the 8th century, and the latter likely belonged to a slightly earlier date, perhaps between the 4th and the 7th century. Of the bowls that have been discovered in secure archaeological contexts, almost all have been found within the territory of Babylonia, which is to say that region of central Iraq where the Tigris and the Euphrates draw close to one another briefly to form the shape of an hourglass. And this is the area from which so many empires of antiquity were governed, including the Akkadian, the Seleucid, the Arsacid, the Sassanid, and of course the Abbasid. And these sites include places like Häberl, which are the first collection of bowls was found, Sippar, Nippur, and Kutha. Perhaps unsurprisingly, the distribution of these finds corresponds to the testimony of the literary texts to the distribution of the Mandæans prior to the advent of Islam, but only in part. While literary texts reference locations throughout the Fertile Crescent, with considerably more references to locations in the western half of the crescent than the eastern half, the incantation texts thus far have only been excavated from locations within Iraq and Iran. So let's talk a bit about those literary texts. Earlier, I had mentioned the Mandaean book of John the Baptist. Among the locations mentioned in the book of John are 4 bodies of water, and that's the Jordan, and we have the right there on the Euphrates, the Karu, of course, from the name of the talk, and then finally the Indian Ocean, the Red Sea, and the Gulf, all of which are collectively known as Yamad Suf. It also includes 2 cities, Jerusalem and Babylon, a mountain, Mount Carmel, and the name of a people, Arabs. In this map, I have indicated the relative proportion of the number of references for discrete locations, such as the cities and the mountains, through the size of the marker. As you can see, Jerusalem alone accounts for the majority of physical places named within the text. The aforementioned Great Treasure, also known as Codex Nazarius, contains a much larger number of people and place names, including rivers. It adds the Tigris. Mountains, such as Mount Sinai, Mount Judah, and Mount Lebanon. Cities, adding Bethlehem and Borsippa, and entire regions, such as Judea. Some of the landmarks of the city of Jerusalem are included as well, such as the Temple and Mount Moriah. Other regions are referenced exclusively through gentilics, such as Indians and Messenians. While the Great Treasure demonstrates a greater familiarity with the eastern half of the Fertile Crescent, it should be obvious from this map that it is still the western half of the crescent that receives the lion's share of attention in these texts. Right? This part right here. Therefore, the known world, as related in the Mandaean scriptures, consists of a narrow band running from roughly 28 degrees to 34 degrees north, and from 33 degrees to 48 degrees east. And that's a rough trapezoid, this area right here. Its corners are defined by Mount Lebanon, Baghdad, the Karun River, and Mount Sinai. Beyond this band, the world as described grows more abstract, defined by distant peoples rather than geographic features such as cities, mountains, and rivers. To the north, there were Greeks and Romans. To the south, there were Arabs. To the east, there were Persians and Indians, and to the west, there were Egyptians. Within the band, two particular areas stand out as being described in considerable detail: the regions of Palestine and Babylonia. It is in these two areas, and particularly in Palestine, that the texts demonstrate their greatest familiarity and their primary geographic focus. So, armed with this evidence, let us now return to the Mandaean question. As we discussed before, the consensus today among Western and Islamic scholars is that the Mandæans are either Mesopotamian, pre-Islamic, and pagan, or Mesopotamian, post-Islamic, and therefore apostate, which is arguably even worse. In either case, they have no place in polite Islamic society today. Furthermore, the Mandæans' own traditions about their origins, namely that they are of Palestinian origin, practice a pre-Islamic faith, and follow a Nazarene doctrine, have been completely discarded by all of these groups. In fact, they've been considered an inauthentic fraud, knowingly perpetrated upon innocent Christian missionaries and their Muslim host societies alike. So far, the evidence we have discussed certainly does not support these hypotheses. If Mandæans are post-Islamic and apostate, then how do we explain the archaeological evidence securely dated to the period of late antiquity prior to the advent of Islam? If Mandæans are the autochthonous Mesopotamian pagans, on the other hand, why are their own texts so much more detailed about the geography of the Levant than Mesopotamia? And why do they unambiguously reject the worship of the stars and the planets? We would expect quite the opposite, actually. Therefore, in the absence of any evidence to substantiate the scholarly claims of the last century, I would argue that it is worth revisiting the Mandæans' own claims about their origins. The primary source for these claims is something called the Scroll of the Great Revelation, also known as the Scroll of Inner Harran, from its incipit, a collection of legends first published by Stefana Drauer in 1953. In this scroll, it details their settlement in a territory identified as Haran Gauaita, or Inner Haran, after the destruction of the Jewish temple. In this text, it is worth noting that the words Mandaean or Sabaean do not appear not even once. And in fact, they're replaced exclusively by the now familiar term Nazarene. Inner Haran, also called the Mountain of the Madai, or Turot Madai in Mandaic, and known in Arabic as Al-Bayadiyah, the White Country, is a secret refuge in which the Nazarenes live free from the domination of other races. It's something like the medieval Christian legend of the domain of Prester John. It was to this refuge that the ancestors of the contemporary community were led by a Parthian ruler named Erdogan. And it is from it that Nazarenes are occasionally brought forth to re-enter the rest of the world. Most scholars agree that this legend contains a kernel of truth. The question is, how much is a kernel? How much truth is in this legend? And it has become one of the longest standing and most contentious cruxes in the history of scholarship on the Mandæans. Much of the debate over Inner Haran has revolved around whether the term refers to a metaphysical location or a physical one. And if so, where might it lie? Lidzbarski proposed the region around Jebel Haran, near the Syrian border with Jordan and Syria, and near Israel, which was known to the Romans as Auranitis, and is today better known as the Jebel Adruz, after the 19th century flight of the Druze to that region following their own persecution in Lebanon. Officially, the same mountain appears on Syrian maps as the Jebel al-Arab, for what Syrian maps are worth today. J.B. Segal proposed the city of Haran, known to the Romans as Karu, on the Turkish border with Syria, southwest of Şanlıurfa. Mainly because he, like Al-Hassani, whom he approvingly quotes, saw the origins of the Mandæans in the pagan cults of that city, which is a tantalizing prospect that has proven irresistible for Orientalists, as we have seen. And finally, Yoram Buckley most recently proposed the Wadi Hauran. the principal affluent of the Euphrates in the Syrian desert, reviving the 19th century thesis of the American Orientalist Samuel Fales Dunlap, who first suggested the Wadi Haran as the means by which the Mandæans attained the head of the Gulf. The Wadi Haran slopes down from the summit of Jebel Laha, right about where the H3 air base is located, and not far from the old fort of Rutba Wells, in a strategic location roughly 110 clicks from where the borders of Jordan, Iraq, and Saudi Arabia converge. From there, it runs to the Euphrates for a distance of about 350 kilometers. In places, it is 60 meters deep and nearly 1.5 kilometers wide. At this point, one might reasonably ask why some of these scholars keep confusing Haran, apparently from the Geminate root harar, to be arid or dry, with Hauran, which is apparently from the hollow root hawar, to be white. The identification of these two is made possible by the complete collapse of the paradigms of geminate and hollow verbs already in classical Mandaic, and the Mandaean oral tradition that identifies Haran with al-Bayadiyya, the white country. This requires us to privilege a derivation from the root hawar, particularly since the root harar has actually left no other traces within classical Mandaic. Lest we jump to the assumption that the collapse of these two roots is the indication of a relatively recent vintage of Mandaean traditions, I would like to note that a similar confusion between these roots is likewise found in the Hebrew Bible. In the book of Genesis, Jacob, the son of Isaac, travels from Beersheba to the decidedly desolate and unurban Haran, where he has a vision in which he is granted all the land that would later bear his name. Now, Beersheba is repeatedly identified as the southernmost extent of the land of Israel, but in the book of Ezekiel, it is not Haran, but rather Hauran, that is identified as his northernmost extent. In the following chapter, Jacob encounters the nomadic Kedemites, or the children of the east, who tell him that they are from Haran. Why exactly would these eastern nomads tell Jacob that they have come from a city on the northernmost fringe of the Fertile Crescent? The most famous of the children of the east is, of course, Job, whom the Bible tells us is from the land of Uz, which is located to the east of the Jordan River, not far to the north. All of the evidence points to identifying Haran with Hauran, and it seems that the Mandaean scriptures are merely following the Hebrew ones in this regard. Not to put a fine line on it, but we can rule out Karai on several grounds. The Haran of the Great Treasure is described as being in the vicinity of Lebanon and Iturea, and is the source of cedars, details which match Auranitis but not Karai. In the Scroll of Great Revelation, Haran Gauaita is specifically called the Mountain of the Madai, Turot Madai, but Karai is located in the plains rather than in mountain country. It was once served by two seasonally fed brooks, but proper rivers, so prominent in the liturgy and the literature of a baptizing sect, are nowhere to be found anywhere near Haran, not within 120 kilometers. And finally, as shown above, the Mandaean sources demonstrate considerable familiarity with the territory around Palestine and Babylon, but they're completely mute about the territory around Karai. In short, there is absolutely no reason and no evidence that the Mandaeans have anything to do with Haran and its infamous star-worshipping pagan Sabaeans, beyond the similarity of the names, and there is no reason to connect these two completely unrelated places and two completely unrelated groups of people. Once we exclude Haran, Lidzbarski's Hauran easily emerges as the only plausible candidate for the Mandaean Haran, or at least the Haran of the Haran Gauaita, of the Great Treasure. Given the facts that I have just mentioned, it would also be an obvious candidate for the Haran of the Inner Harran, the Scroll of Great Revelation, if not for the fact that it was never under Parthian rule, and therefore the Parthians could never have invited the Mandaeans to settle there. So, the problem of resolving Haran with Inner Harran would seem to be intractable until we consider that the term Inner Haran implies the existence of an Outer Haran as well. Perhaps we should be looking not for one Haran, but maybe two. Pauli's Realencyclopädie der klassischen Altertumswissenschaft informs us that the term Auranitis actually did refer to two separate regions in antiquity. The Western Auranitis, which is described by Strabo and Josephus, and it's up here, in the province of a Roman province of Arabia, and a Babylonian Auranitis, which appears in some manuscripts of the Geography of Claudius Ptolemy as a variant form of Auchanitis, which you can see right up here. Was this indeed its original name, confused by subsequent copyists with a similar sounding Auranitis, or is Auranitis indeed the form to be preferred? The Realencyclopädie is agnostic. As you can perhaps see from this much later illustrated version of the geography, Ptolemy situates Auchanitis along the west bank of the Euphrates, and he lists 4 towns within it. Traveling down the river, these are Idikara, there, which Pauli Visova inform us is the ancient name of the modern city of Hit, and Duraba, Takona, and Tel Ben Kane. So where exactly was this Babylonian Auranitis? Apart from Hit, which conveniently for me happens to be located right where the Wadi Haran joins the Euphrates, none of these towns have been satisfactorily identified. Other towns mentioned by Ptolemy in their vicinity have, however, particularly on the east bank of the river. These include Nehardea, one of the earliest centers of Babylonian Judaism, Seleucia, the Seleucid capital, the ancient site of Sipar, which is Tel Abu Haba, Babylon, which I'm sure you've heard of, and Borsippa. These are all, incidentally, either places mentioned in the earliest Mandaean texts or sites where Mandaean artifacts, such as the incantation bowls, were excavated. The fact that this region is bounded to the north and the west by the Wadi Haran, which appears to preserve a reflex of the ancient name of the region, suggests to me at least that the variant Auranitis is to be preferred over Auchanitis. Let us then return to the thesis of Samuel Fales Dunlap, which he posited nearly a century before the Scroll of Inner Harran was discovered and published by Lady Drower. Namely, the Mandæans traveled from their original homeland along the Jordan to the head of the Persian Gulf via the Wadi Haran. Dunlap, a graduate of Harvard University and a member of the American Oriental Society, came to the study of the Mandæans and Semitic philology more generally right here in Berlin, where he served as the cultural attaché to the American legation in 1845, or from 1845 rather. Although not really a mystic or an occultist, his scholarship was very enthusiastically embraced by the occult community, particularly Helena Blavatsky, who shamelessly plagiarized his works, and particularly his works on the Mandæans, for her Isis Unveiled and the Secret Doctrine, which some have described as the Old Testament and the New for the Theosophical Society, include copious quotes from Dunlap's works, very often unattributed. This abstract from Dunlap's book, Sod, the Son of Man, is significant because it relies less upon baseless speculation and more upon the observation of travelers to the region in a time before the imposition of modern boundaries. The celebrated Swiss explorer Jean-Louis Burckhardt, who is perhaps best known for his discovery of the city of Petra, noted that this segment of the Syrian desert was heavily trafficked and even violently contested during the winter season, and that the Wadi Haran was the most important segment of this route. A fact that continued to be noted well into the 20th century by virtually all Westerners who were personally familiar with the region, such as Gertrude Bell, the mother of modern Iraq. It is also perhaps significant that the adjacent region to the east of the plain of Haran and to the north of the Jebel Haran is today known as Al-Lajat, a refuge as its Arabic name indicates, at all times to turbulent tribes, in the words of Philip Hitti. For this reason, we can conclude that the two Harans were indeed contiguous, at least according to the traditional and conceptual geography of the region, if not according to the modern standards of geography that had been imposed upon it during the most recent century. This would then make the Babylonian Auranitis the outer Haran, and the Jebel Haran would be our inner Haran. The mountain called at various points in history the Mandaean mountain, the Druze mountain, and the Arab mountain. This brings me to the conclusion of this lecture, which I hope has been as amusing for you as it has been for me. Unfortunately, my conclusions must necessarily be somewhat sober. I would like to return to the question that occupied me near the beginning of this lecture. What happens to a people when the world seemingly decides that they just don't belong? The recent history of the Mandæans provides us with a master class in the greatest contributions and the greatest limitations of scholarship. Without scholarly interventions on the Mandæans, and particularly the masterful studies of their language and their literature, we would likely be wholly ignorant about them today. Nonetheless, the exclusive focus upon the pages of their texts, without resort to external evidence, such as the physical and conceptual geography of the region in which they live, or the living hermeneutical traditions of the very community that actually composed and transmitted them down across the centuries, has resulted in a very incomplete and at times quite questionable analysis. These deficiencies are no more apparent than in some of the categories that have resulted from these analyses. First and foremost, chief among them, being the connection between the pagan Sabaeans of Haran and the Sabaean Mandæans. A connection between the two, which was outright rejected already in the very earliest Islamic scholarship on the two groups, was revived during the late 19th and earliest 20th century on rather shaky grounds. Stronger and weaker forms of the pagan origins hypothesis click even today, both here and in the Mandaean homeland. As we have seen, these factitious and insufficiently examined categories eventually acquired their own referential and representational powers, with disastrous consequences for the Mandæans. The Orientalists could confidently reject Mandaean claims and construct these factitious categories because they presumed that their hermeneutics were objectively superior to those of the Mandæans. Leaving aside the question of what makes for a superior hermeneutic, I would like to conclude here that attempting to tackle complex questions such as those of historical origins and religious authenticity and legitimacy, without attempting to be critically reflexive, constantly questioning the bases and biases for our own assumptions, and failing to acknowledge our positions as scholars vis-a-vis those of our subjects, render any conclusions that we may make all the more intellectually suspect. The sad history of the Mandæans thus represents for us an exemplary case study in how not to study religion. If scholarship has played a role in depriving the Mandæans of their place in the world, then it is my sincere hope, as someone who has pretensions of being an engaged intellectual, that scholarship may someday contribute to restoring their sense of belonging. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Charles Häberl. This is a fascinating and very political, as you said, a presentation on a very interesting, in the true sense of the word, topic, because it yields interest. We gain something by listening to you and your presentation. I'd like to invite you now to ask questions, and possibly, if you ask questions, please don't make a statement, but ask a question so Charles has a chance to give you an elaborate answer. There is a question out there.
Coming here as an attorney at law and non-familiar with most of the topics, basically with historical interest and the interest to educate myself, why did you pick especially on this minority and choose this for your study, the Mandæans, and not, for example, as you've come across, of course, there are several minorities, the Druze you mentioned, the Jesuits and others.
Yazidis, yes.
Exactly. So where's the importance? Do you see that majorly in the scripts, the written texts that they inherited? Is it the rituals? Is it the geographic relevance to our culture? I would rather like to focus on whether or not we have some influences even across the whole region when we compare it to Gnostic traditions that have been pre-Christian, as we all know, the Nag Hammadi scrolls perhaps. Are there any interconnections that we might be focusing on a totally different approach to religious, to archaeological evidence, to textual evidence, to ritual evidence? What are all those rituals all about? Sorry.
It's a very long and very complicated question.
Thank you.
To start off, why I personally am interested in this community, it all goes back to, and speaking particularly about my position as a scholar, right? I'm interested in them out of personal interest. I happen to think they're very relevant to the questions, broader questions such as Christian origins and the state of affairs in the Middle East today, and so on and so forth. That's certainly true. The reason I focus upon the Mandæans is because I, like a lot of bored teenagers in New Jersey in the 1980s, developed perhaps an unhealthy fascination with the occult. And my mother, who was a school teacher, attempted to channel this interest in the occult into something a little more healthy. So she brought me a catalog of the incantations at the British Museum, because she already knew that I was a little strange as a child, and she figured this couldn't hurt. So I read that catalog of incantations and amulets in the British Museum from cover to cover, and among them were Mandaean incantations, because they happen to be rather well reputed in the Middle East as being masters of magic and other occult aspects, which is really one of the draws, I think, for people like Dan Brown and the other New Agers. So when I started my grad school in 1998, and I mean literally 5 minutes after arriving in Cambridge, I was approached by Joran Buckley and Chip Coakley and a bunch of other scholars who were at Harvard at the time to help organize, as the graduate student assistant, an international Congress of Mandæans. It was the first such thing that had ever occurred. It took place literally on the banks of the River Charles, which, among the other things that I needed to do, was to get renamed the River Jordan for the purposes of the ceremony that was to occur there, because we also had the very first Mandaean baptism in the New World occur on the banks of the River Charles as well. And so one of my responsibilities was running around and making sure that everything was, quote-unquote, kosher for the Mandaean priests who were coming. They could not drink tap water. They needed to drink water straight from the Charles. So I needed to find them an apartment that was located close to the Charles. I needed to make sure that the food that all the Mandaean visitors were getting was kosher, meaning it was fish or vegetables, but no red meat, and so on and so forth. And the people who later became my informants were so impressed by my attention to detail that they literally invited me into their homes. And when I say literally invited me into their homes, they literally invited me into their homes. I was there living in Queens, which is where I did my doctoral fieldwork, eating dinner with them every weekend. I mean, to this day, some of my oldest and dearest friends I number among that community, and it all began in 1998. Now, the question of their relationship to these other groups and to some of these more fundamental questions about the history of the Middle East, about religion, obviously I can't answer that here. But one of the discussions that emerged during dinner was how all of these small groups, these small obscure groups like the ones you mentioned, the Yazidis, the Druze, the Mandæans, and so on and so forth, they're all separate from one another, but they all somehow seem to be related. So for example, I have identified in this presentation, you can disagree with me on this, the Jebel Madai or Jebel Mandai with the Jebel al-Druze in the Haran. It's probably not a coincidence that this also was a refuge for the Druze, and according to Philip Hitti, the eminent Columbia Orientalist, so many other groups throughout history. And of course, we talked earlier about the Yazidis. For those of you who don't know, the Yazidis are a small group from northern Iraq in the area, what is today the Kurdish Autonomous Region, who have been specifically targeted for genocide by ISIS. They're being exterminated left and right. And they have a kind of bizarre, I don't want to say bizarre, but they have a sort of obscure connection with the Mandæans as well. Their seminal figure within their religion is a being known as the peacock angel, Melek Taos. This same figure also appears in the Mandaean scriptures as the second life, the first emanation from the great life, who is their primary religious figure, their primary being of worship. So there's a connection there. Even though they're on opposite poles of Iraq and they're many, many hundreds of kilometers separate from one another, they somehow all seem to be connected in some way, and that really invites further research.
Thank you. This is just great. But we have more questions. There's one question here.
Quick question. Thanks. Oh, okay. The slide where you showed us, where you talked about the present locations of Mandaean communities, went by pretty fast.
Yes.
So
put that up again.
I remember that Sydney was probably the first location you mentioned, and you were just talking about New York. So the question is, where are those Mandaean communities now? How do they keep contact, and what kind of organization, what kind of sense of belonging do they have, and how do they cultivate that?
Well, as with most intentional communities, I don't know how you would describe it, they rely heavily on the internet. Our policy in America when resettling refugees is an Assyrian policy. We don't like to resettle them all in one area, so we scatter them, we disperse them here and there and everywhere. So many of them said they wanted to go to Detroit, where there's a critical mass of Iraqis and even Mandans. They said, the US government said, no, we're going to send you to Worcester, Massachusetts. We're going to send you to San Antonio, Texas. We may even send you to Coeur d'Alene, Idaho, if you're especially bad. And so they ended up being relocated everywhere but where there were men. And the same thing we see with Somali refugees. If you think about where the Somalis who have come to the US have been relocated, well, it's the Twin Cities in Minnesota and in Maine, which are, there are perhaps no connections between Maine and Minnesota to the Somalis. They're some of the whitest states in the country. The weather. But you see, we've deliberately separated them in the hopes of assimilating them. And this is a very tried and true method of assimilating people. So, to answer your question, they are in San Diego, particularly in the neighborhood of El Cajon. They're in San Antonio, they're in Detroit, some are in Virginia Beach, there are many in Long Island, there are some in upstate New York and in Worcester. I think if I had to name the two biggest cities, it would probably be San Antonio and Worcester, Massachusetts. Well, Wasta, as we say.
Yes, there's one question here, and then afterwards it's you.
Thanks very much, Charles. This question is going to come sort of out of left field because I've never come across a Mandaean text in my life. But I'm interested in the relationship between textuality and orality. And I'm kind of curious, from your perspective, as a linguist, how much of your sources are coming from sort of oral interviews versus text sources that exist? Can you give us some sort of like a breakdown of what your sources are like?
I explicitly work with both, I think, and of course there is no real such thing as an oral source unless you're actually recording it yourself, which I've done. Some of my sources I used for writing. As a linguist, I work with folklore primarily because folk tales and legends are among the first corpora of texts that are ever recorded. They're very easy. Folklore is a universal phenomenon. It makes it very easy to elicit text from informants, and it gives people something to read. So I collected a lot of oral texts in that sense, but I'm also reliant upon the accounts of travelers, particularly German ones, such as Petermann, who went to Iraq. He got a sabbatical in 1856, and the Crimean War was in full swing. And so he said, well, it would be nice to spend my sabbatical in Iraq. And so that's where he went. And he has this amazing tale. It's called Reisen im Orient, in which he talks about his travels in the East, in which he encounters this group. And he actually has quite an extensive section on their folklore. And Lady Drower, whom I mentioned subsequently, also collected these oral legends. Now, the reason I say you need to work with both is this. Some of my predecessors, such as Sven Pallas, whom I've mentioned, he was a Danish scholar, primarily an Assyriologist, but his doctoral dissertation was on the Mandæans. It was given the imaginative title of Mandaean Studies. And it was published first in Danish in 1919, and then in English in 1926. And he has a long section upon the relationship between the Mandæans and the Old Testament, in which he concludes that the Mandæans must be a post-Islamic phenomenon because they very incorrectly relate tales from the Old Testament. And one of the evidence that he provides in support of this proposition is that in the story of the crossing of the Red Sea, in the Hebrew Bible, everyone is killed. But in the Mandaean account, Pharaoh and his closest friends are saved. And he says, well, this doesn't happen in the Bible. They got this detail wrong. Therefore, they never met it. And incidentally, they never actually met a Jew. He literally says this in the textbook, in his book. They had no direct knowledge of Jews or Judaism. They had never encountered them. Everything they relied upon was mitigated by Islam. Now, as we've seen, this is patently false. The bowls that I had shown in my presentation were actually found in archaeological contexts, side by side with bowls in the square script, in what we might consider Jewish Babylonian Aramaic, and also Christian texts in the Syriac script. So these communities did live side by side, and this is empirically provable. But the reason I mention this particular account is that later Jewish accounts of the Exodus mention that Pharaoh and his friends were saved, which we might term oral accounts, because they're not actually the ones in the Old Testament, but in the Haggadic literature about the Exodus, this element of the story emerges. So to call it simply erroneous or wrong, well, if we were to apply the same standard to, for example, the Jewish community, we would have to conclude that the Jews were wrong about the Bible, and in fact they had never met a Jew, so that was why they were wrong.
There was a question. Yeah, the gentleman.
Can you say a little bit more about the written sources about the Mandaean text? You showed two examples. One was a clay, and the other one was a metal, the lead.
There are two different corpora that I engage with in my research. And I tend to focus upon the canonical texts of the Mandaean religion, of which there are, I believe, 10, starting with the great treasure, Genzarabba, that I mentioned in the lecture, also translated into Latin as Codex Nazarius, and the Mandaean Book of John, or Drashi Dehye, which I'm translating into English right now. And there are several others, including the Scroll of Great Revelation. These are all codexes and scrolls that have been copied repeatedly by scribes throughout the centuries. Now, you have to remember that this is a living community. It evolves in responses to the times, just as the Jews and the Muslims do as well. So these texts are occasionally updated to keep with the times. And that may be one reason why Lietzmann and Pallas were convinced that this was a late tradition and irrelevant to the question of the history of the Middle East. I don't know. Your question about the epigraphic finds, that's what you're more interested in, more or less? So there's an immense corpus of incantation bowls. These are terracotta bowls. If you've ever seen the film Ghostbusters, are you familiar with this? You know how the Ghostbusters had this box that they would throw on the ground and they would stamp a button, and then the box would open up and the ghost would be sucked inside? Well, some of these bowls are kind of like that. They're demon traps. They're terracotta demon traps. And not all of them, but some of them, you would bury underneath the threshold of your house or at the four corners of your bed to either push away the demons or to trap them, to bind them and oppress them. So demons were a huge problem in Mesopotamia at that time. And so we find these everywhere, usually on the top of the mountains, because in the most recent, they were probably composed during a brief period, let's say starting in the 5th century up until around the 8th or the 9th century. We're not entirely sure. Some of the most recent bowls to be published, there's a corpus of them from a collector, which is published by colleagues of mine in Israel. They produced hundreds of these. They actually have dates in them. So we can securely date them. But they're also associated in strata with the Parthians and with the early Islamic period, with coins and other things. So we can tell more or less when they were composed, or at least buried. The other ones were the amulets. And I'm not certain, a colleague of mine, Christa Müller-Kessler, who's at Jena, has published extensively on these. She may know whether or not any of them were actually found in an archaeological context. I don't believe they were. I think all of them were found on the antiquities market. But they're similar. These are a bit like phylacteries. They were lead. I mean, the Mandæans baptized, so you need something that isn't going to melt. So they would inscribe on these lead scrolls, they would roll them up, and they would wear them on their person or do what I don't know with them. And they very often have long and extensive texts and quotations from the scriptures in them. So these serve as an important witness to the existence of the Mandaean scriptures prior to the age of Islam.
We have time for one more question, or possibly two, but Ezra, go ahead.
It's just a continuation on the terracotta bowls. I was just very fascinated with their perfection. Does the script go inwards or outwards?
It goes outwards. It starts. Well, there are some.
And and how come? I mean, is the sentence finished or something? I mean, is there some craftsperson because of the perfection of the spacing and the scale of the script? Do you anticipate that there was a craftsman who was doing these bowls, many of them, and giving it to families, or is it?
Well, the people who study these bowls would actually say quite the opposite, that they seem to be barely literate. And the one I showed you was actually a very nice example. They're not all so nice. And in fact, I would estimate, I don't need to estimate, the numbers have been run. At least 1 in 5 are totally illegible. Usually they go outwards. Some of them are written in spokes, like on a wagon wheel. Some of them are written in different fields. So they're not, but the most common form is radiating outward from a center circle. And the reason they appear to be associated with circles, has been suggested by some scholars, is it has something to do with a magic circle. Meaning that in times past you would bind demons or exclude them by making a circle in the ground, perhaps with salt. And so the bowl kind of takes the shape of the circle in this regard. But more portable, like the Ghostbusters box.
We have a final question here. I was thinking the front, but you go ahead, and then we have a final question in the front.
Yes, thank you very much for a really fine lecture. I really enjoyed it. I'm very much looking forward to your new edition on the book on John. And over the last few years, we've seen some really fine publication on the historical figure on the John the Baptist by Claire Rothschild and Bruce Chilton and others. And I really wonder, do you think there's any historical information in the book on John the Baptist?
Well, that's a tough question. Whatever my own bias as a scholar may be, at first I came to this question thinking I had adopted the party line, which is namely that this is a minority religion, with a heterodox religion, and when the Middle East became Muslim, after the advent of Islam, they reached out and they found the first person they could reach to, which is John the Baptist, and they said, "Ha, here is our prophet, we are a people of the book," and they ran with it. Now, I no longer believe that. Having looked into this, I don't want to say I've become a true believer, but I do think that there is a kernel of truth to Mandaean legends about John that may have become elaborated, particularly in the centuries after the advent of Islam. And I say this because the liturgies, which are considered both by scholars and by Mandaeans to be the core of their religion, the earliest texts, do actually mention John. In fact, 3 of their most prominent prayers, the Asuth Melki, which they say every day, the Salutation of the Kings mentions him, the Avohatan Kodmoye, which is our forefathers, and they say this during commemorations when they have meals for the dead and such, also mentions him. And then there's Bushet Sheltho Yohanna, which mentions him as well, is the prayer of John's petition. So I also do think that some of these legends of persecution and migration that they tell, in which they connect themselves to the early community of John in Jerusalem, can stand on their own grounds when you subject them to other parallel evidence. And this is one of the things I would like to show in the book for which I was brought here to conduct this fellowship. So actually I have a bit of there's a tension here. Which book is going to be finished? Is it going to be the book of John, the translation, or will it be this book about Mandaean legends of persecution and migration? Probably the book of John, because it's already translated, but I need to clean up it's a poetic work, and so obviously no one is ever going to be 100% happy with it, least of all me.
So we have a question here.
Thank you. In your presentation, you didn't mention one Mandaeist from here in Berlin, namely Rudolf Matzur. And
yes.
I wanted to know
well,
where
I
he
could.
sort of fits into these.
I adumbrated him briefly because it was his was the theory that Haran Gauaita, the Inner Harran, was actually a metaphysical location, and I think there's proof for this. Now, I think that the basis of the legend is located in a physical site. But I also think that he's right when they identified Haran Gauaita with Mshuni Kushto, which is the Mandaean realm of the ideal. It's almost like a realm of Platonic ideals. And it's indeed the place from which the Nazarenes are occasionally brought back into the world when they all disappear here. And this was his theory. He compared it to the Civitas Dei of St. Augustine. And in the book that I'm working on, I'm going to have a chapter about Mshuni Kushto and the relationship between it and the and Inner Haran, for which I'm deeply indebted to the research of Rudolf Matzur. But I didn't know how to fit this into a 40-minute presentation, obviously.
Charles, let me at this point thank you very much. It doesn't mean that the discussion is over. It just means that we relocate. We've heard so much about relocation from here to the next rooms, to drinks and conversation and exchange of ideas. Thank you for a fascinating presentation that ranged from the private to the political, that was both academic and entertaining, a rare feat, and it was so convincing and so fascinating as to the topics that you talk about that some of us have never even heard of before, that I must say I found this an inspiring evening tonight. I really, really enjoyed tonight's lecture. Thank you so much, and we're all invited to have drinks over there. Thank you, Charles.